Purple clover can add as much nitrogen to your soil as a bag of shop-bought fertilizer costing 12 pounds, and it does it for free every single year without you lifting a finger after planting. That is not a guess. It is a fact that farmers in England relied on for over 200 years before the fertilizer companies convinced them to stop. I grew up in the Yorkshire Dales, on land that had belonged to my family for 3 generations before me. My grandfather kept a kitchen garden that fed our entire household through winters that would empty most modern pantries within a month. He never bought a bag of fertilizer in his life, not once, and he was not a poor man out of stubbornness. He simply never needed to, because he understood something about the ground itself that most people have since forgotten. He taught me to grow purple clover between the rows of our vegetables, not around them, not instead of them, but directly between them. And he taught me why. Standing beside me in that garden with soil packed under his fingernails, these were not theories to him. They were daily practice, proven across hard winters by people who had no other choice but to make their soil provide for itself. I am sharing this now because so few people still know it, and that is not something that happened by accident. Somewhere along the way, feeding a garden became something you were told to buy rather than something you were taught to grow. A bag of fertilizer used to be unnecessary because the ground could feed itself if you simply gave it the right partner to grow alongside your vegetables. Now it costs money every season, from companies that have no interest in telling you a humble clover plant could quietly do their job for free. I am not here to call them villains. I am only here to tell you what came before them, so you can weigh the two for yourself. What you are about to hear is not a theory. This was tested across hundreds of winters, by families with no money to waste and no room for guesswork, and it worked for them in exactly the same soil that sits in your garden today. The first thing to understand is what purple clover is actually doing while it grows. Because the real work happens somewhere you cannot see. Purple clover belongs to a family of plants called legumes, and legumes have a very old partnership with a bacteria called rhizobia that lives in small nodules along their roots. Those bacteria take nitrogen directly from the air around the plant, air that is already mostly nitrogen, and convert it into a form the roots can absorb and store. This is called nitrogen fixing, and it means the clover is not simply taking nutrients from your soil the way a hungry vegetable does. It is manufacturing its own fertilizer out of thin air, quite literally, and storing a portion of it in the ground for whatever grows beside it. Farmers in the 18th century did not know the word rhizobia, but they knew the result. Because ground that had grown clover produced stronger wheat and heavier root vegetables the following season without a single cartload of manure. The second thing to understand is why growing clover between your rows works even better than growing it alone in an empty bed. This is called intercropping, and it means letting the clover grow shoulder to shoulder with your vegetables, rather than waiting for a whole season to give it a bed of its own. Picture a row of runner beans or sweet corn, with a low strip of purple clover growing quietly in the gap beside it. While your main crop grows upward and outward, reaching for the light, the clover stays low. Working underground, its roots reaching deep into the soil and drawing up nitrogen the whole time your vegetables are feeding on it. This means your soil is being fed and your crop is being grown in the very same season, rather than one having to wait for the other. Keep listening because the third point explains something most gardeners never think to ask. Why deep roots matter as much as they do. Purple clover does not sit shallow in the topsoil the way many garden plants do. Its roots can travel down a foot or more into the ground, breaking up compacted soil as they go and opening channels that let air and water reach far deeper than they otherwise could. This means the nitrogen it produces is not simply left sitting on the surface. It is delivered down where your vegetables' own roots are searching for it, rather than washing away with the next heavy rain, the way surface-applied fertilizer so often does. My grandfather used to say that a clover root did more honest digging in a season than he could do with a spade in a week. And having turned that soil myself, I never once doubted him. The fourth thing worth knowing is what this living row of clover does to the weeds that would otherwise take over the bare ground between your vegetables. Weeds need open soil and open light to establish themselves, and a strip of clover growing thick and low leaves precious little of either. This is what old countryside gardeners called a living mulch, a covering that is not dead straw or bought compost, but a growing plant doing the job instead. It shades the soil, keeps moisture from evaporating away in the summer sun, and crowds out anything trying to seed itself in the gaps. This means less time spent bent over pulling weeds by hand and less water needed through the driest months of summer. Because the ground beneath that clover simply does not dry out the way bare soil does. But that is only the fourth part of this, and the next one is where most gardeners are genuinely surprised. Timing your sowing correctly changes everything about how well this works. Purple clover seed should typically go into the ground in early spring. Once the last hard frosts have passed, usually sometime in March or April in most parts of England, sow it thinly along the strips between your vegetable rows, roughly 1 gram of seed for every square meter. Scattered by hand across lightly raked soil and covered no deeper than half a centimeter. Clover seed is small, almost like fine grains of sand, and it is easy to sow it far too thickly out of habit, which only crowds the young plants and wastes good seed. Water it gently if the ground is dry, but never let it sit waterlogged because clover seed rots in soggy conditions, just as readily as any other seed does. Sown at the same time as your main crop, the clover will establish itself steadily throughout the growing season, working quietly beneath the taller plants above it. The sixth thing to understand is how this steady, ongoing process compares to the way most people feed their gardens today. Shop-bought fertilizer tends to work in short, sharp bursts, a sudden feeding followed by a slow fade as the nutrients wash through the soil and away. Intercropped clover works differently because it delivers nitrogen gradually, a little at a time, throughout the entire season your vegetables are growing. This produces what old gardeners simply called a steady growth, rather than the quick surge and slow decline that comes from a single application of shop-bought feed. Crops grown this way tend to develop more evenly, without the sudden bursts of growth that can make plants weak and prone to disease, because they are never overfed all at once and never left hungry in between. Listen closely now, because the seventh point is the one that surprises even experienced gardeners the most. You do not need to remove the clover at the end of the season to get its full benefit. When your main crop is finished and the beds are cleared for winter, the clover can simply be cut down at ground level, left lying where it falls as a final layer of mulch across the surface. The roots remain in the soil, still holding their store of nitrogen, breaking down slowly over the winter months and releasing that nitrogen exactly where your next crop's roots will be, searching for it come spring. This is called the chop and drop method, and it was common practice on small holdings that could not spare the labor of digging an entire garden over by hand every autumn. It protects bare soil from winter rain and frost at the very same time it feeds it, something no bag of granules from a garden center can manage on its own. The eighth thing to know concerns the insects that depend on this plant, and why that matters more than most people ever consider. Purple clover flowers, that soft violet color familiar from any English hedgerow, are one of the richest food sources for bees and other pollinators throughout the entire summer. A vegetable garden without enough pollinators is a garden that struggles to set fruit on beans, squash, and anything else that relies on a flower being visited before it can produce. By letting a strip of clover flower for even a few weeks before cutting it back, you are feeding the very insects that will go on to pollinate the runner beans and courgettes growing in the rows right beside it. This was simply understood by countryside people generations ago without needing it explained or written down anywhere. The ninth thing worth knowing is how this practice was used during a period when English gardens were asked to do more than they ever had before. During the years of digging for victory in the 1940s, imported fertilizer became scarce, and every allotment and back garden in the country had to feed itself as best it could. Clover intercropped between vegetable rows became common practice during those years, precisely because it demanded no purchased inputs at all, only seed, sunlight, and a bit of patience. Families who gardened this way through those years often found their soil held up season after season, long after neighboring plots that grew the same crops without any clover began to show signs of exhaustion. It was not a new idea even then. It was simply an old idea being relied upon again, because there was no alternative left to reach for. The 10th and final point is how to bring this into your own garden this very season in the simplest way possible. Choose 2 or 3 rows of vegetables that tend to be hungry feeders: tomatoes, sweet corn, squash, anything that pulls hard from the soil through a long growing season. Leave a narrow strip between each row, no wider than the reach of a hand, and sow your purple clover there at the same time you plant your main crop. Let it grow low and quiet all summer, cutting it back only if it begins to crowd the vegetables themselves, and leave those cuttings lying where they fall as mulch. At the end of the season, cut it down fully and let it rest through winter, feeding the ground that will grow your vegetables again come spring. Do this for 2 or 3 seasons running, and you will likely find your harvests growing steadier and heavier, without a single bag of fertilizer ever entering your garden. I think about this often, more than people might expect from an old man who spends most of his days quietly among his vegetable beds. What strikes me is that this was never really lost knowledge at all. It was simply set aside over the space of a generation or two. While people were told that a quick bag of granules was easier than a season spent growing something alongside their crops, but the clover was never really the slower method. It was working the entire time, underground, out of sight, while the fertilizer sat on a shelf waiting to be bought again next year. What can be reclaimed here is not only a healthier harvest, though it certainly is that. It is the quiet independence of knowing your garden can feed itself season after season without ever needing someone else's product to keep it going. If this has been useful to you, there are more methods where this one came from. I share a new one every day, the same kind of knowledge my grandfather shared with me, standing in a Yorkshire garden a very long time ago. The old ways are still here. You simply have to know where to look.